Hi all, I hope you're doing well today. I thought I'd lay out a couple of thoughts on Keir Starmer's speech on immigration. Now, we knew this was coming. I did a video a couple of days ago saying it's very clear that he's having to take coercive action because the Labour Party are hemorrhaging votes to reform, and he wanted to sound a right-wing note to try and get some of that reform cream and try and re-establish his control. But behind this, it's an admission that Starmer and the Liberal elite are accepting they've lost the narrative around immigration. I'm surprised it's taken this long, but they've finally admitted that it's out of control. Now, of course, they're not doing this because they believe any of this. We must remember, looking over Starmer's year in power, he came in basically on a left liberal ticket. And he started with that ideology. He didn't realise that he was an also-ran who got lucky. The reason he won the election wasn't because the public were desperate for a Labour left-wing leader. It was because there was no effective, patriotic right-wing party to vote for, given the Tories were a total betrayal and Farage had stood down. That meant that he had a free swing. Now, he came in and thought, well, the public are going to love my liberal leftism, the adults are back in the room. However, of course, it was an absolute horror show. It started with Southport, which we've been over many times. It completely mismanaged that and showed he's got no affection for the British people and no understanding of how we feel as a people, ultimately because he's a robotic distance globalist, but it's a video for another time. But somewhere along the line, perhaps about 6 months ago, Starmer made that shift to more, you could say, centrist, right-sounding messaging, especially around things like immigration. Now, again, to believe that he genuinely means any of this would mean you're probably insane and you could never really be helped. We must remember, now he's doing this line of, immigration's out of control, it's damaging the country and has done for years, it's all an experiment, we're your friends and we've got your back, quote unquote. It's just utter BS. If we'd said that 6 months ago, he would have been more than happy to throw us in jail for that. And then he would have slept like a baby as well. He wouldn't bother him at all or his conscience, unless, of course, he's been on the party powder that many people have been insinuating of late. But anyway, in a pure political lens, I think this will play well for Starmer. It shouldn't, but there are people out there who will just buy the rhetoric. And I think I saw this when he was on the verge of being elected. I think some crazy Palestine protesters were yelling at him in a train station. I remember the left-wing media was like, Starmer under fire, he should be more pro-Palestine. And now I'm not particularly pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, none of my business, don't really get involved. But it's evident in this country that the radical types tend to be very pro-Palestine, the rainbow-coloured hair people, the Marxists. And that was very good optics for Starmer, I thought. Walking through a train station, the crazies yelling at him. That says to the centrist dad at home, this guy's normal. Because these bonkers kids with blue hair and nose piercings and baggy jeans are screaming and shouting at him about Che Guevara and Palestine and so on. And I think, this will try, with the immigration stuff, he's going to try and pull that same trick. Look more like the normal guy, rational person. On this channel, I speak a lot about masculine and feminine energy and how we can see in our era it's very feminine. Our messaging around what Britain is very feminine. We're tolerant, we're accepting. It's all about being open and soft. Whereas if anyone wants to implement boundaries, which is the classic masculine symbolic action, they will immediately be seen as evil, just as masculinity is broadly seen as evil in our culture. As I've said many times, in the mainstream, masculinity will only be spoken about through the frame of toxic masculinity, which is essentially neo-Marxist feminism, or a positive masculinity which just apes feminine qualities, like being emotional and being open, being sweet, that sort of stuff. Now this, I would say, damages men even than the traditional masculinity we had before, which, again, I can get it can go overboard, but it's far better than what we've got now. At least it gave men a structure that they could live off, even if it could be a bit too tight and constraining at times. But the point I'm making here is the tone of what Starmer said is a shift. It's a real shift in the tone of how we'd hear a leader speak. And I think, again, they're doing this not because they believe in any of this. He's doing it because he knows that's what the public are craving. Someone behind the scenes has picked up on this. I know some people are saying Blair, that's academic agents thing. Maybe that's the case. Blair is a very astute guy, like him or loathe him. Then there's also maybe the globalist elite en masse. Maybe they're all changing their tone a bit because they can tell populism is rising around the continent. And it's funny here because it's not like there isn't a left-wing argument for anti-mass migration. In fact, I think many of the old-school socialists used to argue against it back in the day for obvious reasons. You're going to undercut the wages of the working class. And if you're there to represent the working class, you should be anti-mass migration. Not to mention the older school leftists, the sort of Arthur Scargill types, may disagree with them on lots of their views, but fundamentally they were British, and they did value Britain in a way that the modern liberals don't. They despise traditional Britain and traditional values. They're globalists, aren't they? That's what they really are. But the point here is that Keir Starmer couldn't give two craps about the indigenous working class. He'd call you racist. Again, he'd be happy to throw you in jail if you too edgy over it. What he wants is to maintain the control of the liberal system, or at least those informing him that's what they want. And Starmer, like the dutiful Starminator he is, will just happily carry out whatever the dictates are. Now, as I touched on in the previous video, it's really important, number one, to just understand what trick they're playing here. And number two, to really be firm on understanding that this is already done. It's already over. It was too late 20 years ago. We had to get Blair out first time round and have a massive shift of the system. That never happened. So what we're left with now is millions upon millions of people here and 1 million plus more illegals who are never going to integrate, who are breeding at high numbers, many of whom are living on the state, many of whom aren't even earning enough to actually be productive to the system. So this is only going to get worse. And when we say, what we need to do is just vote in reform, or Keir Starmer's going to get a bit more hardline, we still must misunderstand the fundamental problem. This is irreversible at this point. And I don't mean to be too downbeat, but I even think that's the case with much remigration. Now, I know remigration is a popular buzzword, and I totally sympathise with the people saying it, and I think that they have a perfectly moral and valid point to be made. But the reason I'm cynical about it is this can too easily be twisted by the mainstream into just deporting illegals, which they should be doing anyway, or just maybe a few criminals here and there with dual nationality. The idea of remigration happening is extremely hard logistically to pull off, but secondly, it assumes that by taking back control of our nation, we can take the policies and practices that we want to happen into reality. That, to me, is a misunderstanding of the situation Britain, Europe, and the Western world is in. This is why, again, you're hearing lots of people speaking about civil war. If there was a civil war, if it even started, the system would crush us before we even began. But second to that, even if we did have a civil war and let's just say some popular uprising took Westminster, well, what then? What can you realistically do? If we really think we can change everything from Westminster, we're not understanding what's really going on, because the problems now are international. That's why when we look at France, Australia, Canada, we see that they're all saying the same thing. The values of Canada, Australia, France are all the same because they're just globalist liberal values. And what does that tell us? Well, there's a globalist liberal system which is at the heart of all of this. It's bigger than one nation. And just as before, when we look at Europe or the Western nations, we can see that before the globalist liberal era, we still were united in some way. We may not have been quite so open about it then because we didn't have the globalist era and the mass migration, which has made us realise actually, a Brit and an Australian are actually pretty similar. Or a Brit and a Frenchman even, which would have been anathema to an Englishman 50 years ago. Now, not so much. But the point I'm making is if we do go back, we can see, well, we did have the same Christian cultures historically. We're rooted in Greek philosophy prior to that. We've had a lot of cultural and economic and political exchange over the years. We have the same spiritual feeling, There's crossover between our groups on a genetic level. And what this means is we once shared an ancient tradition. You could call it the Western tradition. Now, largely that became corrupted in modernity, and that's really accelerated with the tech boom and globalism. And of course, what does this all say? Well, the real issue here, the real thing we have to deal with, it's not Keir Starmer being more tough on immigration, even though he's probably lying anyway. It's not even Nigel Farage and reform. It's understanding that this is civilization-wide. It's the whole of Western civilization that's in a slumber state, it's zombified. It's been detached from its vitality. Of course, I would say that's in the great tradition itself. We need to have spiritual reawakening. We need to understand why we have the boundaries we have. We need to have the confidence to say we can act in a loving, thoughtful manner and not have to imbibe these left-wing mad ideas about bringing in millions upon millions of people from the third world, which are by their very nature going to undermine your country, going to pollute and dilute your culture. Now, that doesn't mean you hate anyone. These are just basic boundaries to maintain a civilization. My point here being that until we start thinking on that level and uniting on that level, not just individually as English people or as Welsh people or as Scottish people, but as people who actually think we're Europeans, we represent the Western tradition, we'd like it to stay alive like our ancestors did, we're never really going to be able to overcome this. But I don't think that this is going to be done either by just simple people making videos like me online. I think this is going to start occurring naturally because people are going to start to wake up to what they've lost. We're going to realise we're in total chaos and the liberal system is doing what it's doing now. It's draconian on the one side and it just moves wherever the public will is to try and maintain its power. But we have to see through it. It's like a shapeshifter. And we have to go back to what's true, foundational, strong and rooted. That's the ancient tradition. That's the connection with our ancestors and what we should be working to give our descendants so we can maintain our way of life and our people long into the future. This is very much why I focus on spiritual and personal transformation. I believe that starts with us as individuals. I focus on that on the new channel, The Sacred Way. You can check that out down below. Other than that, do let me know your thoughts about all this in the comments and consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. Enjoy the rest of your day.